Hello everyone and welcome to the final Rewind review of 2023. Let's go out with a bang, shall we? In this video we are taking a look at the first sequel in the long-running spy franchise as Agent 007 returns From Russia with Love. Released in 1963 and based on the novel by Ian Fleming, From Russia with Love sees James Bond willingly falling into an assassination plot involving a naive Russian beauty in order to retrieve a Soviet encryption device that was stolen by Spectre. Adapted for screen by Richard Maybaum, Joanna Harwood and Berkeley Mather, along with returning director Terence Young, the movie stars Sean Connery, Daniela Bianchi, Pedro Almendraez, Lottie Lenya, Robert Shaw, Bernard Lee, Eunice Gayson, Lois Maxwell, Vladek Sheybal, Anthony Dawson and Desmond Llewellyn. Now, I'm going to be completely honest here, I didn't actually know if I had ever seen this movie before. When I picked this movie to take a look at this year, I was like, oh yeah, From Russia with Love, that's the one with, that's the one... Hang on, what happens in this one? Nope, it turned out I have definitely never seen this movie before. I am a fan of this franchise, I am a fan of this character, but yes, I will admit that there are some additions to this franchise that I have not actually seen before or only partially seen before. Like I said in my review for Dr. No, I have seen a lot of documentaries, a lot of talk shows, a lot of clip shows that do focus on these movies and they do show a lot of clips, sequences, musical segments, all sorts, that it does make me feel like I have seen these films before. This one I think I've seen a couple of clips for in the past, but I couldn't actually remember anything about it. So it does for me feel like I have never seen anything to do with this movie before. It felt like I was going into this film with completely fresh eyes. I had no preconceptions or expectations about it whatsoever. I had no indication of what the story was going to be or anything. I was going into it pretty much blind. And it's a really nice feeling, especially with this franchise. And I'm genuinely glad about that because I really enjoyed this one. And I dare say, even more than the first one. The story this time around sees Bond sent on a simple mission to retrieve a Russian decoding machine called Elector with the help of a woman called Tatiana. But things become more complicated as not only is Tatiana being used as a pawn to seduce Bond, but a mysterious organisation known as S.P.E.C.T.R.E want the device for themselves and send the physically imposing Donald Grant and ex-KGB agent Rosa Klebb to get it and to take Bond out for good. This one is not quite as straightforward as Dr. No was, and in terms of the actual scale and the stakes that are involved in this movie compared to the other Bond movies that have been released over the years, the stakes in this movie are kept relatively small. It maintains a much more grounded approach. It focuses on the spy espionage aspects of James Bond, but it also doubles down on action sequences and using bigger stunts. And that is probably why I liked it more. It's a proper thriller with Bond basically spending a good chunk of the movie being pursued by other agents and having to evade other spies and other forces that have been sent after him to go and retrieve the device back. But Bond also has to defend himself against Spectre, who is this super secret organisation who want revenge on Bond himself because of what happened in Dr. No. It kind of surprised me that this movie does have a continuing plot thread that carries over from Dr. No and goes into Goldfinger, the next movie. I've only ever thought of these movies as very singular events, each movie being their own individual thing without any sort of continuous story going through them, until the Daniel Craig films. But yeah, it was pretty fun seeing that there was a continuation of the story that happened in Dr. No being brought back into this one and seeing a few elements being brought back up from that movie that do have ramifications for what happens in this movie. And then this movie, From Russia with Love, basically like setting up a load of events and a load of things that are going to become important in the future, like a big continuous threat like Spectre, who are going to play a part in future movies. Goldfinger is one of the few Sean Connery Bond movies that I have seen before, and I am familiar with what happens in that movie, but I am keen to actually revisit that now with the knowledge of what happens in these first two movies. I don't think it will change my viewing experience of that movie too much, but I do think that I will pick up on a lot more references and a lot more connections that I probably didn't the first time around. One thing I actually did like about this was actually seeing a lot more of the groundwork being laid down for what it is that the franchise will ultimately go on to do, with a couple of firsts for this series. It features a pre-title sequence that establishes features the threat that Bond will go up against. It features the first Bond theme sung by an artist. The title sequence itself features an instrumental version of that theme song. We get introduced to Q, played by Desmond Llewellyn. There's a few more sprinkles of comedy and more one-liners. Plus, Bond gets the chance to use some fun gadgets. And we also get the introduction of S.P.E.C.T.R.E and their leader Blofeld. And his cat, Mr. Bigglesworth. You know what, I might as well mention this now. I absolutely love the Austin Powers movies, and as I said in my review for Dr. No, when I had actually watched Dr. No for the first time, I started to see where a lot of the references and a lot of the parodies actually stem from when it comes to the Austin Powers films. Dr. No seemed to be like the biggest inspiration for a lot of the parody elements of the Austin Powers films. Turns out that this one is just as influential on the Austin Powers movies, because this is the movie where they kind of borrow most of the elements when it comes to the villains, like number 2 as well as Dr. Evil and how he's introduced, where you don't actually see him at first, you just kind of see the hand, you see the cat and his little console with all the white buttons on it. That is directly from Russia with Love. It is really fun when you do spot those little references that Austin Powers did borrow, and it does make me realise just how good a parody the Austin Powers movies actually are. If you have seen the Austin Powers movies but you've never seen any of the James Bond movies, especially these ones, I highly encourage you to give these ones a go, because I think that you will get a load more out of them. But even so, when it comes to this movie as its own entity within the James Bond franchise, if you are a fan of this character but you've only ever seen some of the more recent ones, this is a very important part of the franchise, and I do think that this is definitely worth watching. Just keep in mind, and I am probably going to say this for the rest of the Sean Connery movies that I do take a look at, please keep in mind that these movies all came out in the 60s. Attitudes, mindsets, the world that we know today was very different back in the 1960s. So with that in mind, I don't think that these movies are going to be the best viewing experience for the more sensitive viewers. So if you do decide to check these movies out, just please keep that in mind. So with that out of the way, let's continue. Sean Connery returns for his second appearance as 007, and once again he absolutely nails the role of James Bond. He maintains that charming, witty and suave personality that he had in Dr. No. There's still a little bit of that cockiness back too, and I liked seeing that it kind of bites him on the backside in this one a little bit, because he knows he's going into a trap, but he does it anyway. And he has to deal with the consequences. And alongside that is the return of that sense of paranoia that James Bond always has, where he's constantly looking over his shoulder and he can never let his guard down, despite letting his guard down multiple times in this movie. I like that he still searches every hotel room that he goes in. As soon as he enters, he's constantly checking every single place that he can possibly think of, the chandelier, the phones, the beds, the picture frames, all sorts, making sure that there's no bugs in the room. And I also really like that every time he gets into a vehicle, he is constantly keeping an eye on the mirror to make sure that there's nothing following him. All of this stuff really does add up, and it makes him feel like a proper spy that has been doing all of this stuff for a very long time. I also really like that we kind of see a bit more of an aggressive side to Bond in this movie, especially after some of the events that do take place in this film. It's just another element that they can add into this movie, into this character, to make him feel a little bit more human. The only real downside to Bond as a character in this movie is that, as a continuation of what happened in Dr. No, it doesn't feel like the character has actually changed, like, at all. And even by the end of this movie, the events that take place throughout this runtime, none of that actually does have much of an impact on Bond. He does not change as a character. There's a load of interesting directions that they could go with Bond as a character, but they don't seem to want to do that. They want to keep the character as he is, consistent throughout the entire series, and I feel like that is a bit disappointing, because I do feel like they could do a lot with his character, but I do like him as a character, and I love Sean Connery in this role. I've also heard that out of the James Bond movies that Sean Connery worked on, this one was his favourite. He is really good in this movie, and I think that he delivers a really solid performance. I think the villains are a bit of a mixed bag for me, with Robert Shaw as Grant and Lottie Lenya as Rosa Klebb. These are the first proper Spectre agents that we get to meet, and each of them do have a good amount of presence and provide a different challenge for Bond. Especially Grant, who they set up really well and show just how strong he actually is, when one of the Spectre agents ends up putting on a knuckle duster, punches him in the stomach, and he doesn't even flinch. How James Bond is able to go toe-to-toe with him later on in the movie, I genuinely don't know, but he does get a really good setup. That being said, compared to other James Bond baddies that have appeared throughout these movies, I don't find these ones as memorable. Spectre themselves, the threat, the resources at their disposal, the fact that they play everyone against each other, and the mystery surrounding both them and their leader is the most interesting part about them. I'm going to be completely honest, I find them far more threatening in this movie compared to how they're portrayed in the Daniel Craig movies. And I feel like a large part of the reason for that is because the mystery surrounding them is allowed to build up and grow over a longer period of time. And it does feel like they are there in the background, in the shadows at any given time, and they could pop up at any given moment. The future of Spectre and Blofeld are set up really well for the future, but as for the villains in this movie, I don't find them very memorable. They do have a good presence whenever they are on screen. The performances from both actors are really good, but I did find these characters underwhelming. Also underwhelming in this movie is the Bond girl Tatiana, played by Daniela Bianchi. Like Honey Rider in Dr. No, they set her up pretty well, and how she's brought into this story is actually interesting, with the way that she's basically told to help who she thinks is the KGB, or they will kill her, so she has absolutely no choice but to do what she's asked. But a lot of that setup with her character does feel a bit wasted, and she doesn't really have that much to do. Her story does feel a bit rushed, and it can get a little bit messy when it does evolve into a love story between her and Bond. And I do think that how her character changes and evolves over the course of this movie to where she ultimately does end up, to me, I don't think that is set up as well as it should be, and it doesn't really feel earned. I think if we spent a little bit more time with her character by either extending out the runtime a little bit more or cutting down on some unnecessary sequences in this movie, then I think that you could free up some valuable time and you could use that to build her character up more. The character does have potential, and the performance from Daniela is really good, but the execution of it all and the direction of her character, it just doesn't work for me. I'm also surprised that this is yet another Bond movie where the Bond girl, Tatiana, is being dubbed over by another voice actress called Barbara Jefford via ADR. The ADR in this movie is pretty mixed for me. There's some stuff in this movie, like what they do with Tatiana, that is actually quite hard to spot. But then there's other sequences, like during a sequence where they're actually on Spectre's base, on Spectre's island, and there's a helicopter that's landed on the ground, and then Kleb is talking to some of the other agents, and it is so obviously ADR that it really stands out. But I do understand that these movies did come out in a very different time where the technology and the audio recording equipment is nowhere near what it is today, so for the time, I do think that it is pretty decent. And that even goes for a few of the green screen sequences in this, which are a bit noticeable. It is weird why this is a reoccurring thing for these movies. It happened in Dr. No with Ursula Andress's character, Honey Rider, and now it's happening again with Tatiana. Apparently the reason why is that Daniela Bianchi, who plays Tatiana, had a very thick, heavy Italian accent, and she didn't really speak much English. You wouldn't know, because honestly that is some of the best ADR that is used in this movie. But I still don't really understand why it is that they feel the need to keep doing this. Either hire people who can do it, or hire a dialect coach to teach them. I said in my review for Dr. No, when I was talking about Nikki van der Zyl, who dubbed over Ursula Andress in that movie, that a lot of these voice actresses don't really seem to get the recognition that they deserve. They do tend to get overlooked whenever somebody does talk about these movies, so I hope that that is something that does change. You know, this is not a big channel by any means, but hopefully by me talking about this and actually bringing it up, it will bring a little bit more attention to that, and hopefully they will get the recognition that they absolutely deserve. But anyway, as for the rest of the cast, I really like who they've cast for each of these roles, and everyone is doing a pretty decent job. I really like Desmond Llewellyn's small appearance as Q, Lois Maxwell back as Miss Moneypenny, Kerim Bey, the charming man who aids Bond on his mission in Istanbul, played by Pedro Armendáriz, plus an uncredited Anthony Dawson as Blofeld. Not everyone gets a lot to do in this movie, but the performances from everyone are really good, and I do like what it is that everyone brings. One aspect that I really liked about this movie is the action and stunt sequences, because they are great. There's a lot more action sequences that are featured in this movie compared to Dr. No, and they feel a lot bigger. I guarantee that this has a bigger budget than Dr. No, and trust me, you can see it on screen. There's obviously some moments that do feel a bit staged. All the older Bond movies I have seen do, but I actually do think that this one feels a bit more realistic and harder hitting. There's a decent variety of action sequences dotted throughout this, including the shootout, the boat chase, and the fight on the Orient Express. It's not quite as catchy as Murder on the Orient Express, but it still sounds cool. In fairness, there actually is a Murder on the Orient Express in this movie, but you don't need Poirot to work out who did it. Anyway, some of these sequences are really well made, choreographed and staged. There's tension, obvious stand-ins, and some great stunt work. The standout sequences for me are easily the helicopter chase where it keeps dive bombing Bond and he has to move out of the way. It really set me on edge just seeing how close that helicopter actually comes to hitting him. It is really, really good. And the fight between Bond and Grant on the Orient Express, which is expertly built up. The tension rises really well, and the actual fight itself is surprisingly a lot more brutal than I was expecting. They paid homage to it in Spectre the movie, but I don't think it's built up anywhere near as well as here. It is a fantastic fight sequence and it had me on the edge of my seat the entire time. There is some genuinely great sequences in this one. It is a great thriller with a good spy story, and I'm really glad how this one turned out. The set design and locations that they use to film are equally great, with a good mix of real places and sets. It's definitely more adventurous with its locations, as Bond gets to visit both Istanbul and Venice, and they picked some absolutely beautiful places to film. There isn't a big lair at the end of the movie like every Bond movie tends to end, where the villain hatches their plan, but I do think that all of the sets that they do include in this movie do look really good. And finally, I can't talk about a James Bond movie without mentioning the music, and this time around the soundtrack is composed by returning composer John Barry. Once again, I do think that some of the themes that they do use in this movie are quite simple and do get a little bit repetitive throughout. They are used a few times throughout this movie, but I do like that a lot of the themes that were established in Dr. No do make a return in this one. And that, of course, includes the return of the James Bond theme, which is, outside of Mission Impossible, the most iconic spy theme that has ever been created for film. It's big, it's bombastic, it fits the tone and style really well. It is really good overall, but unfortunately, this movie has the exact same problem that Dr. No had. And that's that there are times where the music in this movie is placed a bit randomly. You know, James Bond enters a hotel and signs in, and the main theme starts playing. Why? The placement of some of the musical tracks could definitely be a bit better, but overall, it is a good soundtrack. But I've also got to mention that this is actually the first movie, the first of many, to feature an actual theme song. The main theme featured in this one from artist Matt Monro is quite aptly named From Russia with Love. It only appears briefly when Bond makes his first appearance on screen via a radio on a passing boat, but it does get played in full during the closing credits as opposed to the traditional opening titles. It is a nice song and I don't mind it. It's not my favourite Bond theme and I'm not quite sure if it fits the style and tone of this movie, but it is okay and it is definitely worth listening to. Overall, this is another vintage addition to the James Bond franchise. It's definitely not a perfect movie by any means, and there are elements that won't resonate with some people today. It is dated, yes, but with all that said, the performances are really good, the action is bigger and more hard-hitting, the music once again is good and memorable, and the story is both good and engaging. Yes, some of the characters are underdeveloped and some of the story elements feel rushed or messy, plus the ADR and green screen definitely need some work in a few sequences, but I had a really good time with this one, more so than Dr. No. I really enjoyed it overall, and I would absolutely say that fans of action movies, fans of spy thrillers and James Bond should definitely give this a shot. This is an important addition to the franchise and I would absolutely recommend checking this out if you can. But as I said earlier, just keep in mind that this movie was released at a very different point in time. So with all that being said, my rating for From Russia with Love is an 8 out of 10. Well, that is pretty much everything I wanted to say for this review, and this year too. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe, and be sure to hit the notification button to keep up to date on everything that is going on here. If you have seen this movie, let me know down in the comments what you think about it. Plus, if you have any suggestions for any future Rewind reviews you would like to see me do, let me know down below. I will be continuing to take a look at each of the James Bond movies, with next up being Goldfinger, so keep an eye out for that next year. But until then, and for the final time this year, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the new year. See you guys.